So what we're going to see with the Warren Court is it's going to be by far the most liberal court our country's ever had. Earl Warren probably will end up being the second most important Chief Justice in our country's history, kind of far behind who?
John Marshall.
Behind John Marshall. John Marshall was groundbreaking, not only because of the number of court cases that were important, but also because he's literally defining how our government's going to be run through some of these decisions. Warren, while he's not defining from the beginning of the court, is redefining how we look at the court. It's a much more what we call activist court. It is going to push civil rights and civil liberties further than any Supreme Court justice ever had. And Brown versus Board is the first one. Many people in the legal world have made the argument that Brown versus Board, while it is morally the correct decision, that you can make the argument that legally speaking, the court overreached what it was doing, because on some level it was enforcing the integration of schools. Well, who enforces laws? The executive branch does. And they're making an argument that the Supreme Court was enforcing laws and had overreached. The next course I want to talk about is Gideon versus Wainwright, which I made plural. I don't mean to say Wainwrights. It was just the one Wainwright. Do you guys know what Gideon versus Wainwright was about? Emma Lou, you don't remember?
Yes.
Okay, what's it about?
I know what it established. It established that we had to provide counsel if someone could afford it, like a lawyer. He represented himself.
Yeah. Up until this time, unless it was a capital murder trial, you were at your own expense in hiring an attorney. And if you couldn't afford one, you had to defend yourself. This man had been arrested and went on trial, and it was not a capital murder case, and defended himself. What happens a lot, and especially in an area where you have poverty, is you have poor people who are uneducated defending themselves against educated attorneys, right? And so the jails were full of poor people. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were all innocent, but it does mean that the idea of the fair trial becomes sort of reconsidered. And in this trial, Gideon was able to push the court to the Supreme Court. He argued that his Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial had been violated because he did not have access to counsel. The Supreme Court, led by Warren, agreed with this argument, and henceforth, not allowing the right to counsel is a violation of your Sixth Amendment rights to fair trial.
Just a question, how do you, is there like a group of lawyers who works for like the state and that's just their job?
It's called a public defender. Yeah, and in fact public defenders, and many have argued today that the public defenders are, while fine attorneys, these guys, they're still a disadvantage because public defenders have a gigantic amount of caseload. You know, you're talking about, they might have, a regular like prosecutor might have 15 cases he or she is working on, where a public defender might have 85. And you can't spend as much time with each individual client as you'd like. So from that perspective, people have argued still there's not enough money for that. But yeah, the government has to supply a public defender if someone can't afford their own defense attorney.
Are those kinds of people like, I don't know, I feel like they'd be a little messed up after a while.
If you're a public defender?
Yeah.
Well, but you also have to understand, I mean, public defenders, and there's a guy that was my fraternity, a public defender. I haven't known him forever, I just know he is one. And these guys, they don't go to court that much, right? I mean, prosecutors and public defenders don't go to court that much. What usually happens? Yeah, they plea bargain into something, some arrangement to save time, effort, and so for like if you're a public defender, you're trying to, and you think your client will be guilty, you're going to say, okay, let's not go to trial, but you'll get a lesser sentence or whatever. But if you're always defending people who are at fault, presumably, then I guess it would present some sort of mental anguish. But you can also make the argument the same thing about any public servant, right? Cops the same way. You talk to Blackhurst. Blackhurst deals with people who aren't always, the best kids in the school. And it's funny because he and I talk, and This year I'm half and half in AP, but last year, I'm teaching almost all AP kids, so I'm getting all AP kids, and he's arresting the kids. I don't even know what their names are, right? So our experience at the school is way different. There are some teachers who teach classes where none of the kids try. I'm sure you've all been in classes where half the kids care and half the kids don't. In some classes, very few of the kids care, right? Do what?
Oh, yeah, I was thinking 20% of the kids carry 20%.
Right, and so from that perspective, that can be hard too, because you've got some pretty smart people trying to do a really nice thing, and this is what they feel like they're called to do, and many of the kids could care less. That's really hard. So any kind of public servant, and as the representative, one of the representative liberals in the class, Mary, this is one of the things. If you want to help people, this is problematic. I mean, a good example is like public health doctors. Public health doctors, they go into it, they want to help out, poor people. They want to make everyone healthier. And every time they're like, okay, how can you fix this? All right, I need you to eat healthy. I need you to stop smoking. You need to stop drinking. You need to get some exercise and stop eating all this crap. And a year later, they see them again, and what's happened? They've done the same thing, right? I mean, this is one of the problems of the frailty of human weakness.
Yeah.
Where actually somebody like Megan and I got in a conversation one time in Macro, and this goes back to, do you think people are inherently good or are they inherently bad? Megan argued, and it sounds like Calvert has followed the way, that people are inherently not good and have to have rules to corral them. This is the very basis of conservatism, whereas liberalism oftentimes is people are inherently good but have to be taught to do bad things, right? And their environment is what's making them bad. Megan argued very forcefully, and I'm sure Andrew could too, that that's not the case. Capitalism in general and socialism in general are built upon those principles. Capitalism is built upon the principle that the only way you're going to get someone to work is if they get paid to do it, right? And if they don't, they're not going to work. Socialism is predicated upon the fact that people are inherently good or are going to try to make society better, even if, if you're a doctor and you're a socialist, you don't make much more money than somebody who's a janitor or a socialist. Because if you're inherently good, the money doesn't matter. So, do what?
I'm pretty sure I'm a socialist.
But, yeah, you're a socialist until you go to Kroger. But,
What?
there's this, my swim coach is a professional triathlete, and I was like, that is the coolest job title ever. He said, yeah, it's really cool until you go to Kroger and you can't afford anything. Everyone loves equality until they go shopping. But that is, can you see how that's kind of the basis for these intellectual thought, I mean, in terms of the very rawest basis? When it comes to these court cases, we are defining what it means to be liberal or conservative. The 60s were a separation point between liberalism and conservatism, right? Because the counterculture was revolting against what they saw as conservatism. This court case is also represented in Escobedo versus Illinois. Escobedo versus Illinois, Escobedo was arrested and he argued, coerced into admitting guilt during the process of arrest. And in Escobedo versus Illinois, it was decided that all, I wouldn't say defendants, but anyone who's being under arrest has the right not to speak. We call that the right to remain silent. And lastly, in 1964, the court case Miranda versus Arizona. How many of you guys have heard of Miranda rights, right? Well, this is what this comes from, right? Who was Miranda, Emma? You remember?
It was a guy, and I can't remember what he got arrested for, but they basically didn't tell him his rights, and I'm pretty sure he got in a lot of trouble in the trial. He
was arrested for several things, including rape.
Yeah.
And he went to trial, and he had, while you have the right to remain silent, he didn't remain silent, and he admitted guilt.
Yeah.
He claimed that his Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights were not being upheld. He did not know of his right to not testify against himself, a Fifth Amendment right? And that led to him not having a fair trial. In Miranda versus Arizona, it was held that every policeman or any law enforcement agent who arrests a suspected criminal has to inform the suspected criminal of his or her rights. Today we call them the Miranda rights. In fact, he got retried with the Supreme Court. He got retried. He went back to jail. I mean, he was guilty. But the whole point is that who has to do the actual prosecuting? The person under arrest or the actual prosecutors?
Right.
The prosecutors have to, it's their job to put you in jail. It's not your job to tell on yourself. And you have the right to remain silent. So when you hear the Miranda rights, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can or will be used against you in the court of law. That essentially is Escobedo versus Illinois. You have the right to an attorney if you cannot afford one will be provided for you. That is Gideon versus Wainwright. Right? And what they're telling you is your Miranda rights. It comes from Miranda versus Arizona. These three court cases right on top of each other, I think 62, 63, 64, are all redefining the way that we treat our detained people. Now think about this. What somebody like Earl Warren would argue is that if you want to live in a truly civilized society, we have to extend rights even to those people who we might not think deserve them, which are people who are accused of crimes. The rights of the accused are important because if we just put people in jail because we think they're guilty, that might make us less than civilized. And that we are judged on our civilization by how we treat those people with the least amount of rights. And this is sort of the overarching definition of the Warren Court, right? And it's sort of redefining the government action. Now let's move on to women's rights. Let's talk about what was happening to women post-war, Emma Lou. What was happening to women after World War II?
Being shoved back in the home and they locked the door.
They were voluntarily all going back to the home. Not a single woman complained, even though the primary evidence suggests otherwise.
Only if you look at the wrong primary evidence.
All the primary evidence we see that
not
is made up.
accurate.
There were many women who felt a level of independence and self-satisfaction through working during the war that were not happy to give it up. The argument was made, are we going to let the women stay in the factories when the men had these jobs and then they went to go fight a war? Are you going to make them go back in the homes when they're going to fight a war?
Give them some time to relax.
So this is the question at hand. Job sites, many of them are big employers like Ford, GM. They had policies that brought men back. They had, even during the war, they had different levels of pay for men and women. Ironically, before the war started, there were jobs only men could do because women weren't strong enough. Once the war started, women could do those jobs. All of a sudden, those jobs weren't segregated. And then after the war, those jobs became, once again, jobs women couldn't do and only men could do. They paid more. Now, it's to say that every single woman went into the home and stayed there is a misconception. However, it is accurate to say that most middle class and middle upper class women, once they became married, society was giving them some pressure to move back into the home, specifically with the baby boom, with the issues of conformity, with the economic boom. And social pressure was, it was understood, but not necessarily implied. So, how many of you guys read Feminine Mystique? So, quite a few of you read Feminine Mystique.